Chapter 20 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Moonlight Drive. The two herds were held together a second night, but after they had grazed a few hours the next morning, the cattle were thrown together, and the work of cutting out ours commenced. With a double outfit of men available, about 20 men were turned into the herd to do the cutting, the remainder holding the main herd and looking after the cut. The morning was cool, everyone worked with a vim, and in about 2 hours the herds were again separated and ready for the final trimming. Campbell did not expect to move out until he could communicate with the head office of the company, and would go up to Fort Laramie for that purpose during the day, hoping to be able to get a message over the military wire. When his outfit had finished retrimming our herd, and we had looked over his cattle for the last time, the two outfits bade each other farewell, and our herd started on its journey. The unfortunate accident at the ford had depressed our feelings to such an extent that there was an entire absence of hilarity by the way. This morning, the farewell songs generally used in parting with a river which had defied us were omitted. The herd trailed out like an immense serpent, and was guided and controlled by our men as if by mutes. Long before the noon hour, we passed out of sight of 40 Islands, and in the next few days, with the change of scene, the gloom gradually lifted. We were bearing almost due north and passing through a delightful country. To our left ran a range of mountains, while on the other hand sloped off the apparently limitless plain. The scarcity of water was beginning to be felt, for the streams, which had not a source in the mountains on our left, had dried up weeks before our arrival. There was a gradual change of air noticeable too, for we were rapidly gaining altitude, and the heat of the summer being now confined to a few hours at noonday, while the nights were almost too cool for our comfort. When about 3 days out from the North Platte, the mountains disappeared on our left, while on the other hand appeared a rugged-looking country, which we knew must be the approaches of the Black Hills. Another day's drive brought us into the main stage road connecting the railroad on the south with the mining camps which nestled somewhere in those rocky hills to our right. The stage road followed the trail for some 10 or 15 miles before we parted company with it on a dry fork of the Big Cheyenne River. There was a roadhouse and a stage stand where these two thoroughfares separated, the one to the mining camp of Deadwood, while ours, of the Montana Cattle Trail, bore off for the Powder River to the northwest. At this stage stand, we learned that some 20 herds had already passed by to the northern ranges, and that after passing the next fork of the Big Cheyenne, we should find no water until we struck the Powder River, a stretch of 80 miles. The keeper of the roadhouse, a genial host, informed us that this droughty stretch in our front was something unusual, this being one of the driest summers that he had experienced since the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. Here was a new situation to be met, an 80-mile dry drive, and with our experience of a few months before at Indian Lakes fresh in our memories, we set our house in order for the undertaking before us. It was yet 15 miles to the next and last water from the stage stand. There were several dry forks of the Cheyenne beyond, but as they had their source in the tablelands of Wyoming, we could not hope for water in their dry bottoms. The situation was serious, with only this encouragement. Other herds had crossed this arid belt since the streams had dried up, and our Circle Dots could walk with any herd that ever left Texas. The wisdom of mounting us well for just such an emergency reflected the good cow sense of our employer, and we felt easy in regard to our mounts, though there was not a horse or a man too many. In summing up the situation, Flood said, "We've got this advantage over the Indian Lake drive. There is a good moon, and the days are cool. We'll make 25 miles a day covering this stretch, as this herd has never been put to a test yet to see how far they could walk in a day. They'll have to do their sleeping at noon. At least cut it into 2 shifts, and if we get any sleep, we'll have to do the same. Let her come as she will, every day's drive is a day nearer the Blackfoot Agency. We made a dry camp that night on the divide between the roadhouse and the last water, and the next forenoon reached the South Fork of the Big Cheyenne. The water was not even running in it, but there were several long pools, and we held the cattle around them for over an hour until every hoof had been thoroughly watered. McCann had filled every keg and canteen in advance of the arrival of the herd, and Flood had exercised sufficient caution, in view of what lay before us, to buy an extra keg and a bull's-eye lantern at the roadhouse. After watering, we trailed out some 4 or 5 miles and camped for noon, but the herd were allowed to graze forward until they lay down for their noonday rest. As the herd passed opposite the wagon, we cut out a fat 2-year-old stray heifer and killed her for beef, for the inner man must be fortified for the journey before us. After a 2 hours' siesta, we threw the herd on the trail and started on our way. The wagon and saddle horses were held in our immediate rear, for there was no telling when or where we would make our next halt of any consequence. We trailed and grazed the herd alternately until near evening, when the wagon was sent on ahead about 3 miles to get supper, while half the outfit went along to change mounts and catch up horses for those remaining behind with the herd. A half hour before the usual bedding time, the relieved men returned and took the grazing herd, and the others rode into the wagon for supper and a change of mounts. While we shifted our saddles, we smelled the savory odor of fresh beef frying. "Listen to that good old beef talking, will you?" said Joe Stallings as he was bridling his horse. "McCann, I'll take my carne fresco a trifle rare tonight, garnished with a sprig of parsley and a wee bit of lemon." Before we had finished supper, Honeyman had rehooked the mules to the wagon, while the remuda was at hand to follow. Before we left the wagon, a full moon was rising on the eastern horizon, and as we were starting out, Flood gave us these general directions: "I'm going to take the lead with the cook's lantern, and one of you rear men take the new bull's eye. We'll throw the herd on the trail, and between the lead and the rear light, you swingmen want to ride well outside, and you pointmen want to hold the lead cattle so the rear will never be more than a half a mile behind. I'll admit that this is somewhat of an experiment with me, but I don't see any good reason why she won't work. After the moon gets another hour high, we can see a quarter of a mile, and the cattle are so well trail broke that they'll never try to scatter. If it works all right, we'll never bed them short of midnight, and that will put us 10 miles farther. Let's ride, lads." By the time the herd was eased back on the trail, our evening campfire had been passed, while the cattle led out as if walking on a wager. After the first mile on the trail, the men on the point were compelled to ride in the lead if we were to hold them within the desired half mile. The men on the other side, or the swing, were gradually widening until the herd must have reached fully a mile in length. Yet we swing riders were never out of sight of each other. It would have been impossible for any cattle to leave the herd unnoticed. In that moonlight the trail was as plain as day, and after an hour Flood turned his lantern over to one of the pointmen and rode back around the herd to the rear. From my position that first night near the middle of the swing, the lanterns both rear and forward being always in sight, I was as much at sea as anyone as to the length of the herd, knowing the deceitfulness of distance of campfires and other lights by night. The foreman appealed to me as he rode down the column to know the length of the herd, but I could give him no more than a simple guess. I could assure him, however, that the cattle had made no effort to drop out and leave the trail. But a short time after he passed me, I noticed a horseman galloping up the column on the opposite side of the herd, and knew it must be the foreman. Within a short time, someone in the lead wigwagged his lantern. It was answered by the light in the rear, and the next minute the old rear song, "Lippy-la-go, go along, little doggy, you'll make a beef steer by and by," reached us riders in the swing, and we knew the rear guard of cattle was being pushed forward. The distance between the swing men gradually narrowed in our lead, from which we could tell the leaders were being held in, until several times cattle grazed out from the herd, due to the checking in front. At this juncture Flood galloped around the herd a second time, and as he passed us riding along our side, I appealed to him to let them go in front, as it now required constant riding to keep the cattle from leaving the trail to graze. When he passed up the other side, I could distinctly hear the men on that flank making a similar appeal, and shortly afterwards the herd loosened out, and we struck our old gait for several hours. Trailing by moonlight was a novelty to all of us, and in the stillness of those splendid July nights we could hear the pointmen chattering across the lead in front, while well in the rear the rattling of our heavily loaded wagon and the whistling of the horse wrangler to his charges reached our ears. The swingmen were scattered so far apart there was no chance for conversation amongst us, but every once in a while a song would be started, and as it surged up and down the line, every voice, good, bad, and indifferent, joined in. Singing is supposed to have a soothing effect on cattle, though I will vouch for the fact that none of our Circle Dots stopped that night to listen to our vocal efforts. The herd was traveling so nicely that our foreman hardly noticed the passing hours. But along about midnight the singing ceased, and we were nodding in our saddles and wondering if they in the lead were never going to throw off the trail, when a great wigwagging occurred in front, and presently we overtook the rebel, holding the lantern and turning the herd out of the trail. It was then after midnight, and within another half hour we had the cattle bedded down within a few hundred yards of the trail. 1 hour guards was the order of the night, and as soon as our wagon and saddle horses came up, we stretched ropes and caught out our night horses. These we either tied to the wagon wheels or picketed near at hand, and then we sought our blankets for a few hours' sleep. It was 3:30 in the morning when our guard was called, and before the hour passed, the first signs of day were visible in the east. But even before our watch had ended, Flood and the last guard came to our relief, and we pushed the sleeping cattle off the bed ground and started them grazing forward. Cattle will not graze freely in a heavy dew or too early in the morning, and before the sun was high enough to dry the grass, we had put several miles behind us. When the sun was about an hour high, the remainder of the outfit overtook us, and shortly afterward the wagon and saddle horses passed on up the trail, from which it was evident that breakfast would be served in the dining car ahead, as the traveled priest aptly put it. After the sun was well up, the cattle grazed freely for several hours, but when we sighted the remuda and our commissary some 2 miles in our lead, Flood ordered the herd lined up for a count. The Rebel was always a reliable counter, and he and the foreman now rode forward and selected the crossing of a dry wash for the counting. On receiving their signal to come on, we allowed the herd to graze slowly forward, but gradually pointing them into an immense V, and as the point of the herd crossed the dry arroyo, we compelled them to pass in a narrow file between the two counters, when they again spread out fan-like and continued their feeding. The count confirmed the success of our driving by night, and on its completion all but 2 men rode to the wagon for breakfast. By the time the morning meal was disposed of, the herd had come up parallel with the wagon, but a mile to the westward, and as fast as fresh mounts could be saddled, we rode away in small squads to relieve the herders and to turn the cattle into the trail. It was but a little after 8 o'clock in the morning when the herd was again trailing out on the Powder River Trail, and we had already put 30 miles of the dry drive behind us, while so far neither horse nor cattle had been put to any extra exertion. The wagon followed as usual, and for over 3 hours we held the trail without a break, when sighting a divide in our front, the foreman went back and sent the wagon around the herd with instructions to make the noon camp well up on the divide. We threw the herd off the trail within a mile of this stopping place and allowed them to graze, while 2/3 of our outfit galloped away to the wagon. We allowed the cattle to lie down and rest to their complete satisfaction until the middle of the afternoon. Meanwhile, all hands, with the exception of 2 men on herd, also lay down and slept in the shade of the wagon. When the cattle had had several hours' sleep, the want of water made them restless, and they began to rise and graze away. Then all hands were aroused, and we threw them upon the trail. The heat of the day was already over, and until the twilight of the evening we trailed a 3-mile clip, and again threw the herd off to graze. By our traveling and grazing gaits, we could form an approximate idea as to the distance we had covered, and the consensus of opinion of all was that we had already killed over half the distance. The herd was beginning to show the want of water by evening, but amongst our saddle horses the lack of water was more noticeable, as a horse subsisting on grass alone weakens easily, and riding them made them all the more gaunt. When we caught up our mounts that evening, we had used 8 horses to the man since we had left the South Fork, and another one would be required at midnight or whenever we halted. We made our drive the second night with more confidence than the one before, but there were times when the train of cattle must have been nearly 2 miles in length. Yet there was never a halt as long as the man with the lead light could see the one in the rear. We bedded the herd about midnight, and at first break of day the 4th guard with the foreman joined our watch, and we started the cattle again. There was a light dew the second night, and the cattle, hungered by their night walk, went to grazing at once on the damp grass, which would allay their thirst slightly. We allowed them to scatter over several thousand acres, for we were anxious to graze them well before the sun absorbed the moisture, but at the same time every step they took was one less to the coveted Powder River. When we had grazed the herd forward several miles, and the sun was nearly an hour high, the wagon failed to come up, which caused our foreman some slight uneasiness. Nearly another hour passed, and still the wagon did not come up, nor did the outfit put in an appearance. Soon afterwards, however, Moss Strayhorn overtook us and reported that over 40 of our saddle horses were missing, while the work mules had been overtaken nearly 5 miles back on the trail. On account of my ability as a trailer, Flood at once dispatched me to assist Honeyman in recovering the missing horses, instructing someone else to take the remuda and the wagon and horses to follow up the herd. By the time I arrived, most of the boys at camp had secured a change of horses, and I caught up my grulla that I was saving for the last hard ride, for the horse hunt which confronted us. McCann, having no fire built, gave Honeyman and myself an impromptu breakfast and 2 canteens of water. But before we let the wagon get away, we rustled a couple cans of tomatoes and buried them in a cache near the campground, where we would have no trouble in finding them on our return. As the wagon pulled out, we mounted our horses and rode back down the trail. Billy Honeyman understood horses, and at once volunteered the belief that we would have a long ride overtaking the missing saddle stock. The absent horses, he said, were principally the ones which had been under saddle the day before, and as we both knew, a tired, thirsty horse will go miles for water. He recalled also that while we were asleep at noon the day before, 20 miles back on the trail, the horses had found quite a patch of wild sorrel plant, and were foolish over leaving it. Both of us being satisfied that this would hold them for several hours at least, we struck a free gait for it. After we passed the point where the mules had been overtaken, the trail of the horses was distinct enough for us to follow in an easy canter. We saw frequent signs that they left the trail, no doubt to graze, but only for short distances. when they would enter it again and keep it for miles. Shortly before noon we gained the divide above our noon camp of the day before, and there about 2 miles distant we saw our missing horses, feeding over an alkali flat on which grew wild sorrel and other species of sour plants. We rounded them up, and finding none missing, we first secured a change of mounts. The only 2 horses of my mount in this portion of the remuda had both been under saddle the afternoon and night before, and were as gaunt as rails. Honeyman had one unused horse of his mount in the hand, so when taking down our ropes, we halted the horses and began riding slowly around them, forcing them into a compact body. I had my eye on a brown horse of Flood's that had not had a saddle on in a week, and told Billy to fasten to him if he got a chance. This was in violation of all custom, but if the foreman kicked, I had a good excuse to offer. Honeyman was left-handed and threw a rope splendidly, and as we circled around the horses on opposite sides, on signal from him we whirled our lariats and made casts simultaneously. The wrangler fastened to the brown I wanted, and my loop settled around the neck of his unridden horse. As the band broke away from our swinging ropes, a number of them ran afoul of my rope, but I gave the rowel to my grulla, and we shook them off. When I returned the Honeyman, we had exchanged horses and were shifting our saddles. I complimented him on the long throw he had made in catching the brown, and incidentally mentioned that I had read of vaqueros in California who used a 65-foot lariat. "Hell," said Billy, in ridicule of the idea, "there wasn't a man ever born who could throw a 65-foot rope its full length, without he threw it down a well." The sun was straight overhead when we started back to overtake the herd. We struck into a little better than a 5-mile gait on the return trip, and about 2 o'clock sighted a band of saddle horses and a wagon camped perhaps a mile forward and to the side of the trail. On coming near enough, we saw at a glance it was a cow outfit, and after driving our loose horses a good push beyond their camp, we turned and rode back to their wagon. "We'll give them a chance to ask us to eat," said Billy to me, "and if they don't, why, they'll miss a hell of a good chance to entertain hungry men." But the foreman with the stranger wagon proved to be a B County Texan, and our doubts did him an injustice, for although dinner was over, he invited us to dismount and ordered his cook to set out something to eat. They had met our wagon, and McCann had insisted on their taking a quarter of our beef, so we fared well. The outfit was from a ranch near Miles City, Montana, and were going down to receive a herd of cattle at Cheyenne, Wyoming. The cattle had been bought at Ogallala for delivery at the former point, and this wagon was going down with their ranch outfit to take the herd on its arrival. They had brought along about 75 saddle horses from the ranch, though in buying the herd they had taken its remuda of over 100 saddle horses. The foreman informed us that they had met our cattle about the middle of the forenoon, nearly 25 miles out from Powder River. After we had satisfied the inner man, we lost no time getting off, as we could see a long ride ahead of us. But we had occasion, as we rode away, to go through their remuda to cut out a few of our horses which had mixed, and I found I knew over a dozen of their horses by the ranch brands, while Honeyman also recognized quite a few. Though we felt a pride in our mounts, we had to admit that theirs were better, for the effect of climate had transformed horses that we had once ridden on ranches in southern Texas. It does seem incredible, but it is a fact nevertheless, that a horse having reached the years of maturity in a southern climate will grow half a hand taller and carry 200 pounds more flesh when he has undergone the rigors of several northern winters. We halted at our night camp to change horses and to unearth our cached tomatoes, and again set out. By then it was so late in the day that the sun had lost its force, and on this last leg in overtaking the herd we increased our gait steadily until the sun was scarcely an hour high, and yet we never sighted a dust cloud in our front. About sundown we called a few minutes' halt, and after eating our tomatoes and drinking the last of our water, again pushed on. Twilight had faded into dusk before we reached the divide which we had had in sight for several hours, and which we had hoped to gain in time to sight the timber on Powder River before dark. But as we put mile after mile behind us, the divide seemed to move away like a mirage, and the evening star had been shining for an hour before we finally reached it, and sighted, instead of Powder's timber, the campfire of our outfit about 5 miles ahead. We fired several shots on seeing the light, in hope that they might hear us in camp and wait. Otherwise, we knew they would start the herd with the rising of the moon. When we finally reached camp about 9 o'clock at night, everything was in readiness to start, the moon having risen sufficiently. Our shooting, however, had been heard, and horses for a change were tied to the wagon wheels, while the remainder of the remuda was under herd in charge of Rod Wheat. The runaways were thrown into the horse herd while we bolted our suppers. Meantime, McCann informed us that Flood had ridden that afternoon to the Powder River in order to get the lay of the land. He had found it to be 10 or 12 miles distant from the present camp, and the water in the river barely knee-deep to a saddle horse. Beyond it was a fine valley. Before we started, Flood rode in from the herd and said to Honeyman, "I'm going to send the horses and wagon ahead tonight, and you and McCann want to camp on this side of the river, under the hill, and just a few hundred yards below the ford. Throw your saddle horses across the river and build a fire before you go to sleep, so we will have a beacon light to pilot us in case the cattle break into a run on scenting the water. The herd will get in a little after midnight, and after crossing, we'll turn her loose just for luck." It did me good to hear the foreman say that the herd was to be turned loose, for I had been in the saddle since 3 that morning and had ridden over 80 miles, and now had 10 more in sight, while Honeyman would complete the day with over 100 to his credit. We let the remuda take the lead in pulling out, so that the wagon mules could be spurred to their utmost in keeping up with the loose horses. Once they were clear of the herd, we let the cattle into the trail. They had refused to bed down, for they were uneasy with thirst, but the cool weather had saved them any serious suffering. We all felt gala as the herd strung out on the trail. Before we halted again, there would be water for our dumb brutes and rest for ourselves. There was lots of singing that night. "There's one more river to cross," and "Roll, Powder, roll," were wafted out on the night air to the coyotes that howled on our flanks, or to the prairie dogs as they peeped from their burrows at this weird caravan of the night, and the lights which flickered in our front and rear must have been real jack-o'-lanterns or will-o'-the-wisps to these occupants of the plain. Before we had covered half the distance, the herd was strung out over 2 miles, and as Flood rode back to the rear every half hour or so, he showed no inclination to check the lead and give the sore-footed rear guard a chance to close up the column. But about an hour before midnight, we saw a light low down in our front, which gradually increased until the treetops were distinctly visible, and we knew that our wagon had reached the river. On sighting this beacon, the long yell went up and down the column, and the herd walked as only long-legged, thirsty Texas cattle can walk when they scent water. Flood called all the swingmen to the rear, and we threw out a half-circle skirmish line covering a mile in width, so far back that only an occasional glimmer of the lead light could be seen. The trail struck the Powder on an angle, and when within a mile of the river, the swing cattle left the deep-trodden paths and started for the nearest water. The left flank of our skirmish line encountered the cattle as they reached the river and prevented them from drifting up the stream. The pointmen abandoned the leaders when within a few hundred yards of the river. Then the rear guard of cripples and sore-footed cattle came up, and the 2 flanks of horsemen pushed them all across the river until they met, when we turned and galloped into camp, making the night hideous with our yelling. The longest dry drive of the trip had been successfully made, and we all felt jubilant. We stripped bridles and saddles from our tired horses, and unrolling our beds were soon lost in well earned sleep. The stars may have twinkled overhead, and sundry voices of the night may have whispered to us as we lay down to sleep, but we were too tired for poetry or sentiment that night. End of chapter 20.